Hello. I hope everyone is doing well. I thought I would do something a little bit different, and that is talk about something something I actually know I know about. Something that I deal with, not on a daily basis or whenever, but it is part of my job, my real job as a librarian, and that is preservation. And so I actually, when I went to library school, I did take a class, but it wasn't really a hands-on class. So it was more theoretical, but we did have to learn all the basics of preservation versus conservation and things, everything from books to dinosaur bones to things like that, just the theory behind it all. So I thought I'd give everyone some quick tips if they have decks that they are partial to, that they want to keep. They don't want to get their hands on and really mess things up. Preserve the deck, keep it. It's a treasure. It's a limited edition. It's whatever. So there's some things you can do to make sure these things happen. I've actually, this is part one, because part two, I've actually contacted several people to give me their advice and their expertise on the matter. And I will tell you an interesting fact when I go through this. So understanding what is preservation versus conservation. Preservation is what you're doing to stuff now. You don't need to preserve it. You need to preserve it for the future. You don't need to preserve it like it's a jar of jelly or something. Preservation is just making sure you're maintaining proper conditions for an item. So I have this this small deck of Major Arcana, and this is probably, I forget what the date is on this. Where's my date? Yeah, this one doesn't really have a date. I'd have to look it up. I believe this one is from the 90s, early 90s, whereas this one is from the 80s. And this one is looking a little, it's got some paper exposed. But tarot decks give us some really complex issues as far as preservation goes. And here's another one. This is in a pictorial wrap, and this is one of the, this one actually has a signature. There's Patrick Valenza's signature. And here's another example. This one actually came in like a muslin bag. This is from UC, and this is the Eros Tarot, the Garden of Love. Eros Tarot, Eros, Garden of Love. Lovely deck. So they each present different problems, but the basic thing is, let's look at what we're dealing with. So preservation is keeping things the way they are, so that they don't deteriorate or nothing happens to them. Conservation is if there is something happening to an artifact, if it's acidifying, if it's breaking down, if it's starting to deteriorate, crumble, the paper is getting very fragile, not very pliable, things like that. So we're dealing with preservation here, so identifying what we're dealing with. And what we're mainly doing is storage. So we're dealing with storage. Where do we keep our decks? And these are archival standards. So for temperature, it's 68 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 2. Typically, if it's comfortable for you, it's comfortable for archival material. Now, humidity, relative humidity, that's RH, is a little different. Usually you want it a bit on the drier side, but not 0, because that is actually detrimental in itself. So 35% plus or minus. I have seen high as 45% humidity. The average home has about 50 to 60, depending on if your setup. Think about that. The complex thing with tarot cards is they're in a box or they're in wrappers and something, and so they're kind of in a little mini microclimate, like this. There's a box in there, here, where this one was in a bag, in a box, and the cards. There's actually a library that has some in their archives collection, and they take the booklet and the cards out of the box. The box is separate, and they wrap the cards in a cotton twill string, which is commonly used for keeping loose items together. Now for light, of course, UV light is the thing you don't want to have on your deck. It will fade it, but it also breaks down certain properties of the paper. You want little to none. You want it kind of dark. So if you're storing them in a box, if you're storing them on a shelf away from sunlight, you're doing a good job. Now, acidity is a couple things dealing with the paper. A lot of paper had let's see, in the 80s and before, acidity is in the paper itself. And lately, like this paper here, this white paper, it's alkaline forward, and that way it's almost like it stands the test of time as far as aging. A lot of books, you open them up and they say pH-free, pH-neutral pages or something. You actually want the pages to be slightly alkaline, or slightly alkaline, to resist sort of the material. One of the worst things that, as far as paper and preservation, is recycled paper. It breaks down, the fibers are very short, and cotton paper is actually some of the strongest and most durable, apart from animal skin, which is vellum, which breaks down too. But normal paper, as long as it's treated and there's not a lot of acid, it's usually pretty good for standing the test of time. And of course, oxygen reacts with acid in the paper. On books, sometimes you'll see dark edges around the pages, or maybe even speckles from humidity and moisture. And acid, it's called foxine. And people say, oh, I love the smell of libraries. I love the smell of old books. And that's the smell of paper breaking down. But newspapers that are, from the 1800s are still surviving. There are several ways you can go about it. You can deacidify the paper, which can be very expensive. There's different ways of doing that. Getting them out of the air, getting them away from oxygen is important. Like the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, they actually are not in oxygen. They're actually in, is it hydrogen? A fairly inert gas, I believe it's hydrogen. So they don't react. So acidity, sizing, and lignin. Lignin is what is the fibers of the paper itself. Sizing is what is added to the paper to keep it together, to keep it so it doesn't fall apart and crumble in your hands. Both those things, lignin in itself is fairly acidic. Sizing also has its own properties, so those two things together can, over time, break down the paper, and it starts to crumble and become very brittle. There's something called the double fold test, which is horrible, and my archival professor was adamant that it was destructive. You take the corner of a piece of paper and you bend it forward and bend it back, you crease it, and if it pops off, it's failed the double fold test. There's a whole book written about that by Nicholas Baker, and he wrote a whole book about that and how it was just, you don't do that as an archivist. You don't bend paper like that normally. So just being aware of when the deck was made. Like these are this one definitely. I don't know what type of paper the deck is made out of. I don't know. See, it's starting to yellow a bit. I don't know if the paper was originally yellow. Here we have a different type of paper, this brown paper, and then we have a glossy paper. Usually glossy paper means there's clay that's been added to it. That's why when you crumple paper and it's kind of glossy, it kind of crumbles on your hands. There's a clay that's put in it. Clean air, so just air like not full of fumes and exhaust and something. You don't want that. Clean air is kind of important. Major archival installations, libraries have filtration systems, and they regulate the humidity. I worked on them in the, I volunteered in the Mariners Museum where we got a couple donated collections, and I went in, and one of the most interesting things I saw was a whaling book, and every time they caught a whale, they had a whale stamp made out of wood, and they dip it in the blood of the whale and stamp it in the ledger where they caught the whales. And I think it was from the 1700s. Beautiful, huge book, but they kept those things in environmentally controlled areas, which can be very expensive to outfit. Clean, dry hands, no gloves. It used to be you would need to wear gloves, cotton gloves, nitrile gloves. Now the rule of thumb is as long as your hands are clean and dry, which means you washed your hands, you dried them thoroughly, you're free to handle stuff, because the problem with gloves is you lose that tactile motion. So if I was trying to gently open the package of this up with gloves, I lose some of that tactile dexterity, and I could tear the paper, which is of course no good. So just clean, dry hands. If you feel like your hands are getting greasy or sweaty, wash them, dry them, come back. But don't wear gloves if you're handling something you want to keep. The oil in your hands can really discolor things and increase degradation. Stacking storage, weight. So if I'm stacking decks, notice decks like this one, this little packet doesn't weigh hardly anything. I could stack this. This one's fairly heavy, but I don't want to stack them too much, especially if they're in boxes and the boxes start to get smushed. I usually stack mine upright and no more than 2 or 3 on top of each other, depending on how sturdy the box is. Of course, the coffin boxes are fairly sturdy, but then you have ones like these, which is like a slip folder, which is fairly flimsy. I could mush this and it really hurt my cards. So I try to be careful with how I stack them, and just stack them, only a few high. So what happens? You use a deck. Well, that's great. You're using the deck. It's what the deck is meant for. Some of these, like these decks that I pulled, I don't use. They're just collectible. So if you use a deck, oils from your hands are going to discolor the cards. So here is my my deck, and you can see that the edges are yellowed from my hands. There could be fraying, could be mechanical problems where I've shuffled it and maybe chipped some cards. But for the most part, these are in pretty good shape for being almost 30 years old. So I'm happy with them. I've taken care of them. My hands haven't always been clean, and you can tell the oils from my hands are really yellowed them. Wear and tear, of course, but it imparts characteristics on a deck. So this is my deck. If I were to hand this down to someone, it has my personality, my there's something about, if you inherit something and it has issues, problems, then you shift to, am I going to use this, or am I going to preserve it? Do I need to consider conservation of this? So if this was like a 100-year-old deck, maybe I would think about how could I stabilize it for the future. So this yellowing, as long as it's not detrimental, there's no need to, as long as it's not breaking things down, as long as there was no food particles on this, there was no, you don't want insects, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with silverfish. They do nibble on paper, and they leave droppings, and you really got to watch that. Of course, we don't deal with bookworms, but silverfish is a common problem for stuff that's just for stuff that is left and just not touched very often. So be careful of silverfish. They're fairly harmless, but they do nibble on paper. And of course, there's rodents too, and termites. If you have a garage situation, they will get in there and they will eat paper. It's just like wood to them. It's like a milkshake to them because it's so easy to eat. They do love eating paper. And rats, of course, and mice will chew paper up. So be careful where you store things. Never store stuff in like an attic where the temperature fluctuates so much. You want your temperature, you want your humidity to be consistent, as well as your light. Acidity, we can't really control that. It depends on the manufacturer. We can control the air, typically. We can make sure we're in a closed room, or that there's air, coming in through the windows, that it's not stagnant. Clean and dry hands, and how we stack and store. So we can control quite a bit of these things. So one of the interesting things I found when I was doing a little bit of research, Tulane University and the Newcomb Archives, they have a few decks and a tarot decks in their collection, and just some pretty basic mass-produced decks. And this is an archival outlook September-October 2021. And here is something that I thought I would show you. I went to their website, and you can print off their finding aid. And archival collections have finding aids. It's not like a Dewey Decimal System or a Library of Congress call number system. Usually it tells you where the drawers things are in. So here is the one for their collection of 10 items. They only have 10 decks. Repository, it's a tarot collection. It's called NA 380. Majority of material is found within 2016 and 2019, so 3 years. 10 pieces, 10 decks are stored in 6 drawers. Sizes vary. Tarot decks can be accessed by appointment. You have to leave them in the room. And it's a focus on feminist and LGBTQIA artists and authors. It says the Motherpiece Tarot deck, created in '78, was endorsed by Alice Walker. And it's just a little bit of historical stuff. The preferred citation, if you were to look at these, that is how it's, this is in New Orleans, Louisiana. Publication statement. Controlled access headings. African Americans in literature, art, female artists, lesbian gay studies, lesbian artists, literature, queer theory, women in literature. And then here's 1 and 2. So this is in a drawer. It's called the Afro Goddess Tarot Arcanas. 2019, 1 of 10 pieces, the Afro Goddess Tarot Arcanas deck by Andrea Furtick. Magnetically closing card drawer box, a small guidebook, 79 cards, and 1 red velvet drawstring bag. And it tells you more about it. This is usually from the container, which is the item itself, the box. And it says it's 1 box, 79 cards, 1 booklet, and 1 red velvet string, 4 by 5 by 2 inches. Usually it's in centimeters, but it's up to the library. It's in English. I was kind of disappointed that they didn't have more info, like who the publisher was. Drawer 1, drawer 1, drawer 2, drawer 2. And if in the article they stated that they take the cards out of the box, let's see. Once received, the decks are cataloged as part of the Newcomb Archives Tarot Collection, searchable via Tulane's online finding aids database, which is what I looked up. Decks are removed from their original boxes, depending on the quality, so maybe secured with cotton twill tape, and placed in a polyethylene zip-top bag. So if you buy bags, you want to make sure they are acid-free, archival quality. There's a lot of stuff out there that is now going that way. You can easily find stuff on Amazon. Like when I talk about my physique pictorials, I looked for archival approved bags. So they're not reactive, they're not breaking down, they're not releasing esters. Esters are gases of plastics breaking down. Let's see. They're stored in drawers behind the reference desk in the archives reading room. Decks do not circulate, but may be used in the reading room by members of the campus, community, and general public by appointment or during walk-in hours. And here's some of the pictures of the deck. So that was kind of cool to find that. And I thought I'd share that with you. I thought that was really fascinating. In part 2, I'm going to talk more about actually looking at the decks in greater detail and some of the correspondence I've gotten from wanting to do this and contacting other librarians and other archivists, and showing you some other things I thought would be interesting. But this is sort of part one. I wanted to kind of help people think about preserving your collection, because tarot cards can be expensive, and some of us spend quite a bit of money on some of our texts. Yeah, so hopefully you learned just a little bit, but I thought I'd help people out just by kind of talking from my profession. Anyway, thanks for watching.